All right, I think we're going to get started here. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name's Austin. Oh, should I do the mic? All right, cool. My name is Austin. I'm a senior on the Executive Council at the American Enterprise at Brown Group here. It's my pleasure to welcome David Korn, Mary Katharine Ham, and Rich Lowry to Watson for today's discussion. You can give them a hand. All right, Professor Nordlund will be moderating today's panel. She's a lecturer in public policy here at Brown. AEI at Brown, just a few words on us, what we do. We seek to promote competition of ideas by bringing in scholars from the famous DC-based think tank to campus for discussions and panels like this one on a wide range of public policy issues. Our co-sponsors today are Taubman, the Brown Dems, the Brown Republicans, American Enterprise Institute, and we have support from Speak as well. So that's it from me. Looking forward to a great discussion. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Austin, for that introduction. I'm Carrie Nordlund. As Austin said, I'm a lecturer here at Watson. I'm also the Associate Director of the MPA program here at Watson as well. Thank you so much for your time and coming in such rainy weather as well. It's quite a time to be a student of American politics in these times where the daily news cycle feels like it's stretching the bounds of the 24-hour day as well as the space-time continuum. So much happens each and every second. As a political scientist, I am continually fascinated by what is happening in the landscape of American politics. So as I thought about the structure for today, I have a number of prepared questions I'd like to ask the panelists, and that'll be 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then to open it up for a question and answer from the audience. If you're upstairs, if you have a question, please feel free to come down. I really encourage all the students in the room to ask questions. If you don't, it's possible that David may just use the Socratic method and just call on you. If you've been to panels in the past, he's known for just calling on students. But really, this is a chance for us to tap into their expertise and their insight. There's a lot of heated rhetoric out there in the political sphere right now, and that happens both on TV, newspapers, talk radio, and I'm hoping that we can have a very level discussion to really draw and think about the expertise of the panelists, but also for you to think about trends and patterns that you may be seeing in the news. So one of the preambles that I'll say is that if you have a question, to please keep it to one question so we can fit in as many as possible. And again, students, please jot down some notes if you have questions so you can be sure to ask that at the top. So I'll also sprinkle in a few rapid fire questions just to keep things moving along, and again, hope to have a really great discussion. So my first question is around the relationship between the White House and the media. Each of you have very long biographies, so I'll sort of let you fill in the blanks over where your resumes originate from. But the first question is really around this war on the media that many White Houses, doesn't matter who's in the Oval Office, will declare some sort of that the media is the enemy in some way, shape, or form. As I was doing my due diligence for this, I just wanted to look and see the number of press conferences that presidents have held. And in fact, if we think about last week's press conference that President Trump gave, that was the first in the Washington Post had counted in 587 days. Though if you look at the overall trend line for presidents going back to Reagan, President Trump is right in line with the average number of press conferences given. So certainly this is not any outlier when we think about those particular trend lines. So in that setup, my question to you is, in your time in politics, what have you seen either remain the same or is different in this relationship between the White House and the media? David.
Well, you're looking at me. So I would say all White Houses have conflict and tension with the media. I mean, that just goes back, and it's often a different type of conflict and tension, but obviously White Houses want to get their messages out, and they don't want the interference of busybody reporters reporting other things or reporting what they're doing is wrong or what they're saying is not true. And that's always been there. And we can go back and look at, the particulars, but I think Trump does something different than anyone else. And that is not just that he has a war on the media, he has a war on truth. And this whole notion of fake news, which he uses to basically tell his base voters not to believe anything in the New York Times or anything anyplace else, unless, of course, it serves him, and then he will quote the New York Times to make a point when it serves him, I think is incredibly dangerous. And we see dictators around the country, around the world now, when they're challenged by independent media that functions at their, a threat to their lives, are now citing the term fake news. Erdogan, Duterte, Erdogan in Turkey, Duterte in the Philippines, have all adopted this language. Language developed by Steve Bannon, Trump on his own, to say that the media is the enemy of the people. I mean, I really don't like to make hyperbolic comparisons, but it is the tact of any authoritarian or fascistic leader in the past to make these statements and to try to discredit the media at large in order to be able to define the truth in a way that benefits them, or to even challenge the idea that there is such a thing as truth, that there are facts, that are real. We have Kellyanne Conway, of course, famously talking about alternative facts. We have Glenn Kessler, Brown, class of '81, the Washington Post fact checker, who has come up as of 18 months into the Trump presidency with 5,001 false statements made by the president. Now, you can point to things that Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, or George W. Bush, or George H.W. Bush, or Ronald Reagan said that were wrong in the course of their presidencies, but no one comes close to this record. This is not, it is such a difference in quantity that it becomes a difference in kind. And so whether it's stupid things like the size of his inauguration crowd, or to lying about what happened with Kim Jong-un, this president tells lies or makes misrepresentations, however you want to put it, at a staggering pace that really, I think, is stretching the rules and the norms of the system. It's hard for the media to cover someone who tells so many things that are untrue. And it is this pollution of the political discourse, which I think is doing, in some ways, the most damage to the nation at a time of great division, that maybe is only paralleled or succeeded by the 1850s, which of course ended up with the Civil War. So that's where I think the war on the media is really different and much more dangerous at this point in time.
Katharine, what's your perspective?
Yes, first of all, conceded. President Trump tells a lot of lies. Second of all, would you say it is a dictatorial tactic to, say, spy on a bunch of AP reporters, as Obama did, and use the federal government's power to do so? Or to name a journalist of Fox News a co-conspirator in a attempt to out leakers and whatnot?
You seem to be asking me, but
But I'm putting these things out there
tell
because
if it's rhetorical or not.
we can leave it rhetorical.
Okay.
The point being that I think when we assess Trump, who I think is the difference to me is he is far more openly and straightforwardly contemptuous of the press, is that we forget, because some didn't mind so much when Obama used dictatorial tactics to attack the press. And look, I do think it's different. I want to take a slightly different turn, though, which is that I think it's different partly because of this symbiosis between the media and Trump in drama, like this ratcheting up of the news cycle, which many of us in the media sort of tisk and say, oh my gosh, he's always throwing something out there for us and he's distracting us, and yet much of the media lets him lead them around by the nose. We end up covering whatever it is that he was tweeting instead of talking about policy. That is not to say that he's not newsworthy. Obviously, he's the president. But I do think there is this, he has a sort of savant-like ability to get to the press and to turn the press into a tool of his in this giant drama that he is creating every day. And it takes, I think, more self-discipline than many in the media are showing to push back against that. For instance, with things like the leak battles out of the White House and the palace intrigue. If you get too far down that rabbit hole, you're just doing Trump's bidding at some point. And so I think, but also the problem is it rates, right? That's what people want to watch. That's what people want to hear about. They don't want to hear my thoughts on the farm bill. You guys accept it, of course. We can talk about that afterwards over coffee. But I think to me, that is maybe the larger difference. Granted that Trump is very straightforward about how much he dislikes the press, although, as you note, extremely transactional, as he is about everything. But I think this working in concert that media and Trump do is, to me, what feels very different from the Obama era, where I also was doing this work, and where I occasionally did talk about policy. I didn't expect that to be the intellectual heyday of my career. But now Stormy Daniels tweets. And to me, that is the thing that feels perhaps even more different than the hostility, because the hostility has always existed, and some of these pretty hard-nosed tactics have always existed. This amplification of the drama is what feels like a different thing to me.
First of all, let me thank AEI for having us and the Watson Institute for hosting us, and all of us for all of you for being here. It's a pleasure to be here with Mary Katharine, who I've known a very long time and is one of the bravest people I've ever known. And it's a pleasure to be here with David Corn, who I've known a very long time and who is okay. Some of you may not know that actually David had one of the great scoops in the 2012 election. He surfaced the tape where Mitt Romney talked disparagingly of the 47%, and this had enormous impact on the outcome of that election. I've never forgiven David since for that. So I basically agree with everything that's said. I mean, the relationship between a president and the media is always hostile, but this is an entirely different level. No one's ever been as hostile as Donald Trump has. I think he has good reason to be hostile. I don't think a president of the United States, though, should talk about the press like he's about to go out and liquidate the kulaks the way he does when he says the press is the enemy of the people. Also, I think that the specific targeting of Jeff Bezos and saying that Amazon should be punished in various ways and have to pay more taxes almost exclusively because of the coverage of the Washington Post of this president, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, is among the worst things that President Trump has done. But on the other hand, I think that the press, which has always been biased and subject to groupthink, has really taken, since Trump's nomination for president by the Republicans in 2016, as a permission slip to really be totally open in its hostility and hatred towards this president. And the mainstream press, including what are supposed to be respectable outlets, have never been as hysterical and less credible than they are now. But I agree with Mary Katharine, this is a deeply symbiotic relationship. Trump hates the press. Trump loves the press. You want to understand Donald Trump, story about young teenage Donald Trump. His father, of course, was a real estate developer in New York. So his father wanted to get a lot of publicity, never did it on the level that his son did, but would go to ribbon cuttings and all sorts of events and try to get his name in the papers. And at the opening of the Verrazano Bridge in New York, there's a big event, and Trump's dad was there, dignitaries were there, and there's a big picture of the ribbon cutting of the bridge. It was going to be on the front page of all the papers in New York City at the time. There were a lot of papers then. And little young Donald Trump noticed that the architect of the bridge was left out of the shot. He was standing off on the side. He was too shy, too modest, whatever. He wasn't going to be the shot. And Trump looked at him and said, that guy, he is a loser. He did more to build this bridge than anyone else, and he's not going to get the attention that he deserves. And that's when Donald Trump resolved to get more attention than he deserved the rest of his life, which he's done. And a lot of these lies, if you go through the list of 5,000 or whatever it is, some of them are just outright deliberate deception. Did he have an affair with Stormy Daniels? What was this Trump Tower meeting about? But a lot of it is what they call in real estate puffery, which is never being satisfied with something good. You have to make it better, about 100% better. So I have a friend who knows a Trump advance guy from the 2016 campaign, and Trump was having an event in Roanoke, Virginia, I believe it was, and packed to the rafters, as these events often were, and Trump was in the green room, hadn't gone out to see the crowd, and as we know, he cares about crowd size, so he asked this guy, I haven't been out there, what's the crowd like? He says, sir, it's amazing, it's packed to the rafters, it's 5,000 people. Trump says, really, that's amazing, 8,000 people here in Roanoke? And then he gets on the phone and calls a friend and says, Jim, you won't believe it, there are 10,000 people here to see me in Virginia, and that's just the way he is. Now, is that ideal in a president of the United States? No, it isn't. I wish he were different. But that's the kind of guy he is, and he loves the media attention. He'll bang on the New York Times and say how fake it is, but if he wants to get something out, he'll call Maggie Haberman of the New York Times. And the press at the same time is outraged by everything he does and says, covers it obsessively, and enjoys all the news subscriptions and all the audience ratings that come from this reality show we're living in.
I also wanted to welcome Karen Finney, who's with us via Skype due to some travel troubles, and wanted to know, Karen, what your thoughts are. Hi, Karen. There you are.
Oh my God, how terrifying to be on the big stage like that.
Karen, what is your perspective on the relationship between White Houses and the media? And is there anything particularly unique?
Sure. I'm going to take a slightly different perspective, having worked in the Clinton administration. So from the perspective of having been a White House press person and, working with the media, it has always been a fairly contentious relationship. But at the same time, part of, like, when I do media training, part of what you teach people, candidates and elected officials, is obviously the media reporters are a channel essentially to get information out. And part of what I think has changed in this day and age is that we have multiple channels, including Twitter and social media, where you can have a direct line to the president. One of the things that I find fascinating is, as a White House, I feel for his press staff, because, you can't effectively have a pushback strategy when you go in a room and you have the strategic discussion and everybody's decided, here's what we're going to do. And then President Trump goes out and he tweets something totally different while, others are standing at the podium in the briefing room saying something, saying the exact opposite. And so I think part of it is Trump, certainly, and he is a unique figure in many ways. And I think actually it's pretty remarkable that one fact we can all agree on is that he lies. But I think it's also interesting in this day and age that we have, and I think this will be something going forward, where it is an authentic voice when you hear him, when you see him tweeting. People cover it as news because the White House has said you should treat that as a statement from the president. But I also think that it puts his press staff in a difficult position. And I would just add to this, when we're talking about this relationship, part of what makes this relationship so toxic is, and I've talked to a lot of friends who cover President Trump now and who've covered other presidents, sitting there in the briefing room knowing that whether it's Sarah Sanders, or whoever is at the press secretary is lying to you. I think, that adds to the antagonistic nature of the relationship, because when Sean Spicer, got up there the day after the inauguration and was talking about the figures, it was, sort of infuriating. And I actually know Sean Spicer. I worked at the DNC when he was at the RNC, and it was just shocking to me to see him standing at the podium of the White House briefing room, which I will tell you, if you are a press staffer in Washington, D.C., that is like the holy grail. That is the job of jobs. And to see him abusing that. And so I would just add that, yes, the president lies, and that certainly makes the relationship toxic. But then you have a press team that is either, perpetuating his lies or trying to, one of my favorite phrases is, what he meant to say was, but they feed it. And so I think part of the challenge that we as consumers and what journalists have is, a friend of mine who writes for the Washington Post said, you have to ask 10 people, essentially 10 different sources, to try to figure out what's true when you're trying to report something. And that just, I think, adds to the toxicity of this moment.
I'd like to bring up sort of in the big picture line of things, the party polarization that seemingly exists in this country. Rich, I noticed in your Twitter feed that you had linked to 2 voicemails that were vitriolic, to say the least, coming from the left. And so I'm trying to get a sense of how bad is the polarization from your particular perch, or maybe it's not so bad and there's reasons for optimism. How deep does it go?
The other day that aren't really very bad in the scheme of things, just calling me a jackass and cursing me out, which is mild in our current environment.
Are you whining about that? Come on.
I said they're mild. So I think in considering this question, we're all a little bit wrong-footed by the persistent belief in our politics that the decades immediately following World War II were kind of the norm in this country that we need to get back to, when there was, for several decades at least, a rough political consensus that was a follow-on from the unifying effects of World War II, that were a reflection of this kind of corporatist consensus we had, where there's cooperation between corporations and unions and government and big institutions that had a lot of trust. And when the media was controlled by just a few big outlets. And that is not the norm in American history. The rest of American history has been much more tumultuous and rancorous. And even this period, post-World War II period, had run out and come to an end by the late 1960s. So I think we're experiencing something that's closer to the norm. We're just not used to it. But there's no doubt that partisan divide is huge. The cultural divide is enormous. And there is a risk that we're going down a path where we'll see a kind of divisiveness that we haven't in a very long time, including like low-level political violence. I'm all in favor of demonstrations, protests, dissent. I don't like these confrontations of people, when they're out having dinner or at their private homes. And I think we're just a few steps away from, having senators beaten on the street or public officials physically assaulted, and getting to a place where public officials on both sides are going to need basically 24-hour security. And I think that's a very disturbing thing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reason for pessimism on this point. I grew up in an extremely liberal college town in Durham, North Carolina. And as all my neighbors say, she was such a nice girl. But they made me. They created me. But one of the things I took away from that experience, I went to school with people who believed differently than I did. I went to school with people who grew up differently than I did. I was always the ideological minority, often the racial minority. And those were extremely valuable experiences for me. And what I see too often these days, and I do a lot of college talks about free speech and embracing free speech, is that there is no longer a consensus that embracing free speech or talking to people who disagree with you is enriching or interesting or rewarding or fun. In fact, it will taint you with those people's bad and evil ideas, and you should not break bread with them. That is more often, I'm obviously characterizing two ends of a spectrum here, but I'm often cheerleading for the idea that you should speak to people with whom you disagree, when I didn't feel like I had to do that maybe 5-10 years ago. And I think that is a problem. And it is a problem when we view our political adversaries as evil instead of wrong, and it leads us down bad paths where we wish to physically confront people and or take on speech with violence, which is not a great way of protest. In fact, that goes beyond protest. So I think there are a lot of reasons for pessimism. I will also say that when I do these talks, that I often have perfectly civilized conversations with plenty of people who disagree with me. And even those who thought it would not be rewarding or fun or interesting to speak to me, and in fact protested that I was there or required that I get extra security so that I could go to a college event, they actually end up, dare I say, enjoying it. And so I think it's long, slow, hard work to get people to come together in those ways, but it happens so much more often in real life than on social media. And so I think we do get, often as journalists, we get too wrapped up in the constant Twitter swirl that normal people are not always caught up in. And there are different ways of doing things outside of it. For instance, and we don't have to get into this subject just yet, but in the week of the Kavanaugh hearings, you would think, and I talked to several friends who are conservative who thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to have dinner with my liberal friends this week. How's this going to go? It could be very contentious. And in real life, between actual friends, it's not that way. So I think bringing more of that to our politics, it sounds so namby-pamby, but bringing more of that to our politics and the way of being friends and normal people approach these things as if it is not apocalyptic and the most important thing in your life, makes us more capable of crossing that divide. And I just like to take the message as optimistic and perhaps silly as it is, that I enjoy doing that, and I'm happy to cross that divide wherever it is available to me, and I wish more people were excited about that.
Well, take my hand and we'll go across the divide. No, I mean, we do live in a time of tribalized, divisive politics, and Rich is right. We've often had that in our historical past. I mentioned the 1850s earlier. To me, there are we could spend a lot of time going into the roots of all this, but I see in what's tragic, a deliberate exploitation of this. And I can point to ways I think the Republican Party have done this strategically over the years. You go back to the Southern strategy of Richard Nixon, which was built on racial resentment. If you don't know what it is, you can use this thing called Google. You can go to Ronald Reagan, attacking welfare queens, as if that was a major problem at the time. It really wasn't. And you can go on up, particularly to Donald Trump, and even before that, John Boehner and the Tea Party. When the Obamacare was about to pass, John Boehner sponsored, this is the #1 Republican in the House, sponsored a rally on the steps of the Capitol where Tea Party people were shouting Nazi, Nazi, Nazi at Democrats going in. Now, there's always been, on the right and the left, extremes and extreme rhetoric. But the difference here is this is being sponsored and okayed by the Republican leadership itself, which I believe wanted to take the fuel of the Tea Party and ride that tiger. In fact, they've become the tail of the tiger. And John Boehner, you can just look at his tragic fall as a sign of that. And that brings you to a guy called Donald Trump. How did he get to be a conservative darling? By pushing the birther conspiracy, a racist conspiracy theory trying to delegitimize the very nature of Barack Obama, saying he was not an American. What's the point there? Well, we know what the point is. Okay, so while there are all sorts of fringe people making that case, and you can point to fringe people on the left with their own conspiracy theories, on the left side, they're not adopted by the leadership of the Republican Party. And this is what happened. Donald Trump embraced this. He became a conservative darling, and no one in the Republican Party said, we don't want you. When he was doing this in 2012, Mitt Romney sought his endorsement and thus legitimized and rationalized what Trump was doing. And so it brings us to today. Is Trump trying to heal the divisions, trying to walk across the divide with Mary, Catherine, and myself? No, he's exploiting them. And I can tell you this, I know people on the right don't want to believe this. I didn't know Barack Obama well, but I had a few moments when I spent time with him. And I can tell you, when he was president, he really believed he had to be president for all Americans, even for those who voted against him. He felt he needed to reach out, and even, people on the right will say, well, then why did he push Obamacare? Why did he do that? He thought, as the leader of this country, that was part of the job description. And where he could, try to heal divisions. What does Donald Trump do? We have the demonstration with the tiki torches of the white nationalists, which is far more troubling to me than a bunch of people making it hard for Ted Cruz to have dinner. I'm not a big fan of that. But here we have white nationalists marching in an event that becomes lethal. An American citizen is killed. And Donald Trump says, very fine people on both sides. So while we have this division out there, I think we're going to be stuck in this as long as we have political leaders who are doing everything they can to turn it to their own advantage and keep us divided and keep it chaotic and tribalized.
Karen.
So a couple of things that I would say. Number one, I completely agree with David that having worked on the Clinton campaign, watching Donald Trump exploit what I have politely called cultural anxiety, but which really was racism and other isms, was incredibly painful. Because, whereas there are legitimate places where we disagree and fears that people have, he turned that fear into anger and into a motivation to vote for him. And he's continued to do that. And the chaotic nature, I think, of the way he governs keeps us in this constant state of kind of anxiety of sort of trying to figure out, what's coming next. So I think that is a huge problem, and whoever succeeds Trump is going to have a huge task of trying to heal that breach. But the others, I would offer two other insights, though. I will say that I do think the media plays a role in this. It goes back to something that Katharine was talking about, which is, it's clickbait and it's eyeballs and it's drama to cover and to always look for the fault lines. I mean, one of the candidates that I'm working with this cycle is Stacey Abrams, who is running for governor. Some of you all may know. She would be the first African-American woman governor in the history of our country, and literally have had to have numerous conversations with reporters who automatically wanted to categorize her and the race in Georgia along very partisan lines. One of the things that we talked to folks about is, the issue landscape is actually playing very differently in Georgia. 48% of Republicans support Medicaid expansion, and yet the coverage that it was getting was still this sort of right-left divide about health care. So yes, I think it is very real the way the president chooses to, and the Republican Party, it was shameful. I think after what happened in Charlottesville, that more from all sides didn't speak out more clearly and more loudly about what was going on. I think if you you think about what happened last week with the Kavanaugh hearings, in terms of women coming forward, and that's an issue that really transcended our political tribalism. So I think there are places where there are issues that transcend, but the stakes have become so high in terms of reaching across the aisle or, talking to having friends across the aisle, that I think that's part of what keeps us in our corners. And the last thing, since we're talking to students, I feel like we should be a little bit positive, which is, I'm also a product of the loving generation. And one of the things that we know from the civil rights movement is that the way change happens, the most powerful change, is really on that individual interpersonal level. And I think, so one of the reasons, though, that I think things have really broken down in Washington is we don't have those kinds of interpersonal relationships necessarily. I think we saw a bit of it with Chris Coons and Senator Flake, but I think that adds to it. So, we're tribalized, whether we're online or in our networks, our homes, what have you, and then we don't have those bridges where we can open up conversation. And again, I think the president exploits that every chance he gets.
So speaking of tribalism, I'm going to do a rapid fire, and the question is, what party will take the House and the Senate? Karen, do you predict House and Senate, which party?
Democrats in the House. I think it will remain close in the Senate. I'm going to say Democrats. I'm going to be optimistic.
So blue wave, maybe. I've heard blue wave, pink typhoon. David, what House, Senate?
You know, I've really given up doing predictions. I just don't.
So say we all.
Yeah, I don't see the point. I know people like that. It's interesting to look at some of the indicators now. I know this is rapid fire, but you know the generic number when you ask people, would you prefer a Democratic or Republican member of the House, is at an all-time high in advantage for the Democrats, 10% a difference, and sometimes it goes even a little higher. And so to me, the question is that there's no doubt a blue wave, but you know, you never can measure a wave until it hits. And so we don't know if it's a moderate wave or a more decisive wave like we had in 1994 with Republicans and Newt Gingrich coming into power. So right now, everything being equal, it does look like that wave will probably turn the House. We don't know by how much. It could be just by 1 or 2, or it could be by a significant amount. And the size of that wave will determine whether we're talking between like the 48 and the 52-yard line in the Senate. So it could end up, if you put a gun to my head, I'll be a coward and say I'm predicting 50-50 in the Senate.
Well, that'll help the polarization.
Yes.
I would say House goes. I hate to be queen conventional wisdom over here, but House goes to the Democrats. Republicans keep the Senate, but it should be stipulated that is not a great victory because the map was so advantageous to them that basically it's just a giant blown opportunity to pick up a bunch of seats. But I do think they'll keep the Senate. And I wanted to add to the tribalism. I know. I'm sorry. I'm filibustering on our lightning round. But to caution everybody against the idea that it is its own symptom of tribalism to assume that the other side's tribe is the only one that's cynical, is the only one that's dividing us. And you're welcome to gauge it as you see fit, who's doing it more at any given time, but every political leader is doing it. And so I think assuming only bad of the other side and not looking inwardly enough can in fact increase tribalism, something to look out for.
I agree with the conventional wisdom. Democrats will take the House. They're just close if you tip all the Clinton districts held by Republicans their way, and Republicans in all those districts are very endangered. And there's some signs now that Republican campaign committees are pulling out of some seats that are beyond those, that are more Republican than those seats. So it's a pretty good indicator they're going to lose the House. And certainly Republicans have been acting like all year long in the House that they're going to lose the House. I mean, the Speaker doesn't say, I'm quitting and not running again, if he thinks he's going to hold the House. But Republicans are likely to hold the Senate as a function, as Mary Catherine says, of the map. So this will be an election, if it turns out that way, Democrats in the House, Republicans in the Senate, where you will have had a blue wave in the House, especially suburban districts, and everyone sort of mocks him when he says it, but you may well have a red wave in these redder rural Trump states where Republicans will knock out some Democratic incumbents. So my optimistic take, the country will be divided more than ever before. The election will be a function of that division, and if Democrats take the House with any margin of error, no matter what Nancy Pelosi or anyone says now, they will impeach Donald Trump, and that will be a toxic debate that will take us into through 2019 into 2020, just in time for a toxic presidential election.
Can't wait.
On another toxic topic, here's my second rapid fire question. Will the president fire Rod Rosenstein after the election?
Just Rod Rosenstein,
Yes.
not Sessions.
We can do both.
I hope Sessions hasn't, signed a new lease in Washington. I don't know. Can you guys think of any time when we've had more telegraphing of a firing in a sort of a slow motion way? I mean, I've been, on the Rosenstein question, and I cover the Mueller stuff pretty closely. I did a book on this called Russian Roulette with Michael Isikoff that came out a few months ago, and I've been impressed. Let me say this. I'm going to cross the divide here. I've been impressed by Donald Trump the past few days. First he said, Dr. Ford's story was compelling, and, he didn't dismiss her like he had earlier, like he had done with every other woman who's ever raised a question about him. And then he also said, I'm going to put off the Rosenstein thing. He had a chance to create chaos, and he turned it down. I mean, I don't know what's going on here, but I think he was just doing this because he's been told, don't do this before the election, don't fire Sessions before the election. Afterward, it's going to be hammer time.
Okay, Mary Catherine.
As I always say, the improbable Donald Trump campaign to make Jeff Sessions sympathetic to basically all Americans continues apace.
That's so right.
Who thought we'd be here? I'm going to take the long bet and say no. He doesn't fire them. He just keeps toying with the press and saying he's going to, and then he doesn't. I mean, the Rosenstein thing is a perfect example of like, why did we do this? Why did we spend all morning on this? Why did we spend a national news cycle on this when it was not a thing? Could we not have determined that it was not a thing
Trump
before
wasn't
we
even in
decided
DC.
it was a thing? And so that's a perfect example of the sort of circus-like nature of Trump and his ability to throw the very thing that will drum everyone up for half a day and then go, never mind. Fun to watch you, though. I mean, that is where we are. And I think, like I said, it is very hard to know how to react to this White House because it is very different. But one of my issues with media coverage is that often the argument against him is that he disrupts norms and undermines institutions. And so too often the press is like, you know what we should do? Disrupt some norms and undermine our institution in order to fight back. And I think that is the exact wrong tack, and it actually just erodes trust more when you need it most.
Yeah, David used the word for what Trump's doing with Sessions, telegraphing. I think it's a little weak word. He's humiliating him publicly as much as possible. I mean, this is an unprecedented, among many, episode in American political history. I don't think he'll fire them after the election. I think he'll wait to the end of the Mueller probe or be convinced to do so, and then fire both of them in the most hideously cruel manner possible. But, the one tell to me that he wasn't going to fire Rosenstein, a week or so ago. Time runs together in this period. You never know whether it's a day or a year. But when he says I'm going to meet with him, he never fires anyone face to face except for in his reality program. And this is like a couple of weeks ago when one of the blowups happened with Sessions, and Sessions, they have to sit in the 8th floor of the Justice Department, decide whether to actually fire back at the president or not. And this is one instance when they did, with a very sharp statement pushing back. It was on the chyron of every single cable TV, station in the country. There's a TV in the Oval Office, right? He says he doesn't watch TV. Every meeting he kind of has half an eye on the TV, and he has a meeting with Sessions like right then, and he doesn't mention it to Sessions at all. So he no matter how tough he is at rallies or on Twitter, he hates personal confrontation. So my further prediction will be that when and if they're fired, it will be over Twitter.
Karen.
So just a quick story to follow up. So Sally Yates has this story that actually they tried to fire her by email, but somehow they had the wrong email address, so it bounced back. So what they actually called her. So Rich, to your point, you're exactly right. There's, being invited to go to the White House for a meeting is probably the safest place you can be if you think you're about to get fired, ironically. I would say I think Rod Rosenstein gets fired after the election because I think Trump will see, if the Republicans keep the Senate or the House, I think Rosenstein is out because I think Trump will see that as a victory and he will spin it as, some sort of approval of the way he's conducting business. And I suspect that Sessions, once the Mueller probe is completed, will be out. I think Lindsey Graham thinks he's going to get that job, but I bet you he doesn't end up getting it.
Oh, interesting prediction. Audience, please, if you have questions, if you're upstairs, please come down and ask your question in the back. And if you can introduce yourself, please.
Wait for the mic, please.
Hi, I'm Alex. Thank you for coming. It's been a great panel so far. I guess to play devil's advocate here, how do you and the rest of the mainstream media kind of convince your average American that you are credible and that you are the trustworthy source when I guess kind of an easy example is to look at the Knight Ridder case in '03 when every major outlet got the rationale behind the Iraq War wrong, but only one media outlet actually was able to do the deep digging. And so I know there's probably other examples to look at, but how does the mainstream media grab back the credibility and trustworthiness of your average American?
I'll say that in '03, I wasn't working for Knight Ridder. I was working for The Nation magazine, but I was being as skeptical as they were too. And it's really one of the proudest things I can point to in my journalistic career. This is really a chicken and the egg type of question, because you have a lot of people kind of nichified in their media consumption, whether they're watching Fox or MSNBC or CNN or reading the National Review or Mother Jones or the Daily Caller or Huffington Post. And, they tend to believe the media that they consume. Otherwise, they wouldn't consume it. They tend not to believe the media they don't consume. And it's hard to sort of figure out how you get people to expand their horizons. They make their own choices. But to me, what's sort of damaging here, or at least what's different from the days when, maybe Rich and I grew up, I'm not sure about Mary Catherine, is that this widespread proliferation of media allows people to sort of enter the political debate without an agreed upon set of facts. Because we used to yell and scream about the mainstream media, meaning the Washington Post, New York Times, and the three network news, for not covering things the way we wanted to cover them, either from the left or from the right, ignoring massacres in El Salvador, or being too liberal, as Jesse Helms said of Dan Rather for decades. But at least people could walk out of watch and absorb that, and then have something to argue about. But now, I'm telling you, if you watch Fox News, it really feels like a completely different planet from MSNBC or even CNN. So when there's breaking news about the Mueller probe or Stormy Daniels or something, they barely mention it. And they come up with other stories of what I would call right-wing grievances about immigrants and other matters. And so, when it comes to the mainstream media, which is what you're talking about credibility, Times, the Post, network news shows, I think by and large they do great jobs. I know these reporters. They're working hard. I think the problem is when politicians use them as piñatas for their own purposes. And people need to, see through that and read this stuff carefully and try to come to their own conclusions, not be led by the nose by politicians who say, don't believe that story because it's unfair to me.
Mary Catherine, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I take a different take, which is distrust in media does not exist because Trump attacks media. It far predates that. He is, in fact, a symptom of it. And his open contempt for media is part of the reason that people voted for him. And the reason that distrust existed before Donald Trump is because the media is often very, very bad at its job and unfair to the many, many people in America who it hasn't met and doesn't travel in the circles that they travel in. And look, I'm a fourth generation newspaper journalist. My great grandfather started the daily newspaper in beautiful Pitts, Georgia. My grandfather was a sports reporter, my father was a newspaper man, and I worked at a newspaper before I came to DC. I'm steeped in this stuff, and my take as a right-leaning person who's worked in media for a long time, my take on or my approach with the industry that I love is, help me help you. Help me help you, because this divide between us and the people who voted for Donald Trump and the nation at large is real, and it needs to be crossed in order to communicate news to them, which is what we seek to do. And I think that the national media has not grappled with the fact that perhaps its most glaring mistake was completely missing that Trump was coming. And the day after the election, when all of us were wrong, I would stipulate I was slightly less wrong. I gave him like a 40% chance of pulling this off. We all went out there and we put on our suits and we did the same thing the next day as if we hadn't been catastrophically wrong in exactly what we were supposed to do the day before and had never seen any of this coming our way. And I think the inability to grapple with that publicly makes the problem worse. And I was out there like, you were wrong, you were wrong, you were wrong. We were so wrong. It's like Oprah's favorite things were wrong. That's how wrong we were. And we need to admit that openly and enthusiastically. And yes, the press does correct itself sometimes when it gets things wrong. It often corrects itself a little bit more quietly than it first got the thing wrong. During the Kavanaugh stuff, there has been utterly horrendous reporting on this that just flies in the face of truth. Just doesn't get facts right from transcripts or the actual testimony. Or for instance, you could take an easier one. The New York Times hit piece on the curtains in Nikki Haley's office. For that, we're going to throw away our credibility? It's not a wise move. And so I think the good news is, if you look at hold on real quick. If you look at there's a Pointer study where they did a behavioral study of giving people different kinds of news, including an attack from Trump in a fake news, in a fabricated news story, and a story where CNN made a mistake and then fired some people. A brief moment of optimism. Even the most Trump-friendly group in that behavioral study, when they read the piece about CNN getting something wrong and then firing folks, they did not rate their trust going down, even though the mistake was made, because the mistake was rectified and somebody was punished for it. On the other end, those folks also, no group did their trust go down when Trump attacked the media. So I think we put more stock in that than we should, and we put less stock in correcting ourselves loudly than we should.
Let's do another question, and then I'll start with you, Karen. Another question? Anybody? Don't be shy.
Calling somebody.
Oh, here we go.
That's you.
And just introduce yourself, too.
Hey, I'm Fox. I'm a junior here. I think all of you mentioned Twitter at one point, and I was wondering, do you think the meteoric rise in social and internet communication played any causal role in this election?
Karen,
In the coming election or the previous?
I could hear the whole
And in the,
question.
sure. Karen, the question is around social media and the impact that it had in 2016.
yes.
Next question.
Well, let's see. David, as he mentioned, wrote a whole book about one part of the impact of social media. So let's put, the sort of Russian meddling and bots aside. It's interesting. So one of the things we know is that people trust information that they get from someone they know more than any other source, which was part of why in 2016, if your friend forwarded you something from Facebook, or when your friends retweet something, it has such an impact because you figure, oh, well, if David retweeted it, I assume it's fine because surely he vetted it. So I think one of the ironies about social media is it helps us do something that, traditional campaigning, right, knocking on doors, in a way, at a much more scalable way in terms of communicating with groups of people. One of the things that I think we will see, though, increasingly is two things that I'm thrilled about. I think that will be very actually positive. One is, traditionally we did some of it in 2016, not enough. Cell phones are not always included in polling. So I think more polling will actually will use cell phones because most people don't have home phones anymore. I suspect I know there are people already trying to figure out how to use social media as another way to do more gathering of information about voters. And it also enables you to ask people to connect with their own networks to get information out. But I think one of the biggest changes that we're going to see is you have to, and this is something I say to candidates all the time, and frankly, just from when I was as a commentator at MSNBC, and I'm sure these guys know, people have, you have a direct relationship with people on Twitter and Facebook, and so authenticity really matters. And so I think one thing you can say about Donald Trump, he is very authentic on Twitter. So, but what I think you're going to see is all of the candidates, and I say all of them because on the Democratic side we might have 20 or more, will have to have some, a very strong social media presence, but it's going to have to feel very authentic, because the cost to not be authentic, particularly I think when you're up against someone who is so authentic, is going to be very high. So I think that's one of the biggest ways we're going to see social media, in addition to the sort of tactical ways that we'll see social media play a role. I think it will also be a way in which people will decide how they feel about the candidate.
Rich?
Yeah, obviously social media had a huge effect in the 2016 election. The Obama campaign had been pioneers in this area, and the Trump campaign, for whatever reason, just outpaced the Hillary Clinton campaign on Facebook and social media generally. I think the social media is a good thing and is another symptom of the phenomenon David was hitting on earlier in the Knight Ridder question. It used to be that there are three networks where you got your news and three anchors, and they were referred to seriously, somewhat ironically, but seriously, as the voice of God. And for me, that is not a good media environment. And what we have now, it has downsides, but it's better. The downsides, you are empowering a bunch of kooks. You know, National Review used to have a
How dare
role.
you talk about my followers like that?
Used to have a role as a guardrail, you know, on the right. But now it doesn't matter whether we call Alex Jones a poisonous toad or not. We do. But it doesn't matter whether we publish Milo Yiannopoulos or not. We never would. They can go out and get a following. Now, they have much less of a following because they're both off Twitter now. But that's just a function of our political environment, the media environment. And if you're a dissenter from mainstream conventional wisdom, whether you're on the left or on the right, you have a much bigger potential to have a megaphone now than ever before. And I think that's a good thing. And again, there are downsides, but another upside is if you actually want to be informed and you actually want to know what the left and the right are saying, and you want to know it faster than ever before, you have the means to do that if you're responsible and you click around a little bit and you diversify what you consume.
Yeah, I was going to say, quick shout out also to social media for giving us access to primary sources, right?
Yes.
It takes time, it takes work, that's part of your responsibility as a citizen, and sometimes it can be a pain, but you can go search out the full video of someone saying something. You can go search out the full transcript, and that is something we did not have at our disposal not very long ago.
It also changes the nature of the relationship between media and consumers. Now, I have a lot of followers, and I can't be in touch with every single one of them. But every time I do a story, or even if I'm thinking about doing a story, I have an immediate focus group of people who respond online, and in a way that, you know, I can get a sense of what people want, what they like, what I think I'm doing wrong. And it's also a way that we can engage in immediate debates on stories. I mean, I follow Rich on Twitter, and I tell him when he's wrong, which is often in my view.
I never listen to his feedback, and he never listens to mine. That's how it goes.
Well, yeah, and yesterday I got into this with John Podhoretz, who ended up blocking me because he didn't like the fact that I pointed out he supported the Iraq War. But I do think it changes the nature, and you know, it used to just be information in one direction, us to you. Now there is a different dynamic that goes on, and it can be painful and hateful at times, but I think ultimately it sort of breaks down the barrier a bit.
I think we have time for one last question. Seth.
Hello, my name's Seth Higgins. I'm a master's student here at Watson. Thank you all for being here. Particularly thank you, Rich. I'm a big NR fan, so this is a pretty cool opportunity for me. I'm from...
I get this at Brown University all the time. That's why I don't like to come here.
So I'm from north central Pennsylvania. It's kind of like a little slice of Appalachia, and I was just in western New York for a wedding, and there was signs, barns painted Trump, but there's also old barns painted supporting the Tea Party, and they didn't mention immigration. They didn't mention these cultural grievances that you brought up, Mr. Korn. They mentioned small government, low taxes, and liberty. So there seems to be this mischaracterization that people are quite comfortable with the Southern strategy. Somehow Southern people are backwards, Appalachian people are backwards, rural people don't have a voice. How much of this isn't so much driven by social media, it's driven by an urban-rural divide and a misunderstanding of rural people?
Yeah, that's a huge element of what's going on, obviously, and it goes to what we were talking about earlier with the media credibility. I mean, the media exists in a bubble, and I am in that bubble, and I'm fully aware of it. Just a little indication: I live and work in New York City, and during the Republican primaries, I'm a rock-ribbed Republican, so I went out dutifully and voted for Ted Cruz. And the New York Times has this great feature where you can look precinct by precinct and see the vote totals. So I looked the next day, and my wife and I accounted for 20% of the Cruz vote in our precinct. And we thought that's high, do the math. And then I looked at the precinct just south of us, and there was one Cruz voter. I was like, I know that guy. He goes to my church. So the media is kind of out of sympathy, I think. There's been more of an attempt since the 2016 election, but out of sympathy with an enormous swath of America. And I think it's just sort of, it's how it's set up, and I don't think it's ever going to be different. These major media institutions, they're not based in Tulsa, they're based in New York City and Washington, D.C., and sort of certain attitudes come with that. These reporters sort of swim in that sea, which makes it difficult for them to realize, in some instances, their own biases.
When I mentioned the Southern strategy, that's not to say that Southerners are less intelligent than others. The Southern strategy was devised by the Nixon campaign to win voters in the South who were previously Democratic, by dealing with racial and appealing to racial resentments, very specific. This is not, you're shaking your head. You can go.
George Wallace won those states, sir.
I'm saying Nixon had a strategy. Kevin Phillips, this is not really a debatable point. Kevin Phillips created a strategy for the Nixon campaign that they called the Southern strategy to swing Democratic voters who had previously voted for Democrats, but who were, white, whether they were rural or urban, but had resentments about the changes under the Civil Rights Act passed by Lyndon Johnson to vote Republican. And I will say on the rural-urban divide, I think this is actually a serious issue that is going to be a bit of a democratic crisis in this country. If you look at the Senate, increasingly, the Senate is, in terms of proportional representation, is disproportionately representing rural people at the expense of urban. So 2 senators in Wyoming, 2 in California, and the demographic pattern of this country is urbanization. So we have more people moving to areas where in the cities, which are going to have 2 Democratic senators, and far less people staying in rural areas, which will have 2 senators. And so, you're heading to a situation in a couple of years, not too far down the road, where you will have a large block of senators, maybe Republican if things stay as they are, representing a much smaller number of Americans than the Democratic side. And that gets to issues of, just small d democracy.
Just
I
very
wonder.
quickly
Hold
on
on.
the-
I wonder if there's a solution by which we could create another house where the determination by state is determined by population. Stick with me.
Can I just very quickly address the Southern strategy? I know we don't want to go down this rabbit hole. But if you look at factually, the first Republican to have a breakthrough in the South was Dwight D. Eisenhower. No one idea of a racist. He did it in areas that weren't the deep yellow dog South, but instead new suburban, affluent areas in the South. That was the pattern, except for Barry Goldwater, who did win deep Southern states, based on his opposition to the Civil Rights Act, which was driven by his libertarianism, misbegotten and a mistaken position, but Barry Goldwater was not a racist. And that was the pattern over time. And Republicans appealed to Southern voters, low taxes, small government, strong defense, and patriotism. And you look at Alabama, the Alabama state legislature did not flip. The very most yellow dog Democrats in rural areas of Alabama did not flip till 2010. So the idea that Republicans, beginning with Dwight Eisenhower, ran a racist campaign in the South and won all these racist voters is not true. They grew in the areas with a lot of new migrants into the South, and in places where Southern voters were rich enough to actually care about taxes in a way they hadn't before, federal taxes.
Just Google Southern strategy and Kevin Phillips. I'm not saying that you're wrong, Rich, but
Whatever,
Nixon
everything I said is
Nixon-
factually
no,
correct.
The Nixon
and you
campaign,
can Google it as well.
Yeah, but the Nixon campaign made an explicit
But
effort.
just because they say Southern strategy doesn't mean
So I'm going
Republicans
to try
are
to
racist.
pull us out for just a second. And Karen, can we, since we're talking about urban, rural, and the South,
Yeah.
can you, yes, please go.
Yeah. Let's have this race conversation another day because I'm with you, David. But I want to go back to the question because as someone who is actually doing work in the state of Georgia, one of the problems, and I'm a Democrat, but I will tell you that one of the problems that I see is number one, the decline in local media is part of the problem. I mean, think about how many newspapers are closing down, and so are therefore in terms of traditional media sources, there is less local reporting going on in general. And I'll tell you the other side of it is, I mean, in Atlanta, Georgia, we have the New York Times represented, and the couple of people who are there from the New York Times actually are from Georgia, and they got the story as wrong as some of the other folks. I think part of it is, now that media, mass media is it is a money-making endeavor that changes. And David, I think you're in a different category. But I remember after the 2016 election, at a briefing after the fact, Jeff Zucker from CNN said, as people were registering their concerns about the nature of the coverage, he said, "Well, you know what? My shareholders are happy." So I think part of it is, and one of the things that I've seen is that sometimes there is a pressure to write a certain narrative, like certain narratives get set around what, left and right and this tribalism. So I was saying before about some of the ways these things become more entrenched. And so I do think that part of it is, we have to push journalists and local reporters and national reporters too, to, be more aware of what is happening out in the country. As I said, in Georgia, I had a conversation with a reporter in Washington, D.C. who said, well, name me one, topic, one issue that your candidate supports that isn't liberal. And again, I said, well, Medicaid expansion in the state of Georgia is over 50% popularity because 40% of Republicans support it. So your perspective from Washington is not actually what's happening in Georgia. So I think part of it is, and that's one of the things I think is so good about political campaigns, presidential campaigns, is it makes journalists get out on the road and go see what is happening on the ground. Too much, I think, of reporting these days is not done by, original sourcing, going to the place yourself and talking to people and seeing what's happening on the ground and making certain assumptions. And I think we've got to get out of that as a way to push back on some of these issues.
We have more time than I thought, which is great because we have so much more to discuss. So I'd like to go down another rabbit hole, and that's what happened late last week with the Kavanaugh hearing. I'm wondering what the quality of coverage was from your particular perspective of the hearings.
You take that one, Rich.
Well, I think the great thing about an event like that is the coverage doesn't matter. 20% of households tuned in to hear Christine Ford and Brett Kavanaugh. And that's probably a low estimate when you talk about people who watched it at work, watched it in airports, watched it online later. And, I think this is one of the great things about the new media era, is that we all can watch so much directly, whether it's a Trump rally or a congressional hearing. So, we can nitpick about things that people have gotten wrong or false narratives, but basically, everybody got to see the two primary actors make their best cases and judge for themselves. And then everything else that I think happens is really, really quite secondary. The political coverage, who's up, who's down, how this affects the midterms, Mitch McConnell's strategy, Republicans complaining about leaks in process and trying to distract from the issue, what's happening with the FBI investigation. I mean, this is all happening so much in the glare of public attention that I think it's hard for the media to fuck it up.
But they have. That's amazing.
I knew you guys were. I did that on purpose.
It's amazing how they managed to do it.
Sometimes
Yeah.
you just want to give someone a good setup.
The press has been its very worst in the Kavanaugh episode. I mean, the idea the New Yorker went with the story from an accuser at Yale who had no idea whether her accusation is true or not, had to think about it for days with the help of her Democratic lawyer. And even her story that appears in the New Yorker, she does not know that Brett Kavanaugh did this. She heard someone say Brett Kavanaugh did it, and that's why she thinks she did it. And we've now gone from Brett Kavanaugh was guilty of sexual assault to, he threw ice at someone in a bar at Yale, and this is supposedly relevant because he lied about not drinking excessively during his during the congressional hearings, the Senate hearing. And there's a great thing over the weekend in the New York Times. There's a sentence in the New York Times about this. It said, Brett Kavanaugh denied excessive drinking in the hearings, period. Then it was a quote from the hearings, like 3 sentences from Brett Kavanaugh that included, and yes, sometimes I drank too much. So this is a case where the media has bought into this meme that he somehow denied excessive drinking when you actually look at the transcript in black and white, and he said he drank to excess at times, and the Times even quoted him saying this, and the same time it said he wasn't saying it, because they're so beholden to this group thing. So I think what's been done to Brett Kavanaugh is a disgrace. I think Christine Blasey Ford was compelling, but her story has major holes in it, including she has no idea how she got to this party, where the party was, what year it happened, or, significantly in my view, after this traumatic event, I would think part of the terror would be when you exit the front door, you're in a suburb, in a leafy part of suburban Maryland, presumably in the dark, with no way to get home. No way to get home after you allegedly have been attacked. And you have no memory
You don't
of
know
how you got home.
You don't know she had no way to get home. A friend might have brought her home, and she doesn't
who was the
remember
friend?
that.
Who was the
she
friend?
doesn't remember that.
Who is the friend?
She says she doesn't remember that.
Right.
She
Well,
even
my
described
point- my point
She
is
even
that-
described as a scientist why certain traumatic memories
That's
are
bad
fragmentary.
science.
So
Karen.
Google Emily Yoffe in the Atlantic and read about that science.
Karen.
It's bogus.
Yeah. Just to be very clear, there is absolute science, and she was talking about it, about the way sense memory and the way the body and the brain remembers traumatic events, and it is why you can remember certain sights and sounds and smells, but you can't remember, some of the other particulars. That being said, I think I think it absolutely matters if you're seeking to be a Supreme Court justice. If you lie in front of the Senate and you show, pretty disgusting temperament, I think that matters. But more importantly, in terms of your question about the coverage, one of the things that I thought that I was a bit disappointed by, and I think it shows you the power that media has. All due credit to Jeff Flake for doing what he did to slow things, to get the FBI investigation. But really, the heroes are the 2 women who had the guts to confront him and to tell their story. I mean, they're the reason that he obviously was rattled enough to then say, okay, we've got to do this FBI investigation. And yet most of the coverage, this is where I was disappointed in the coverage, so much of the coverage Friday night and into the weekend was less about them and more about him. And I think these women really deserve an incredible amount of credit because, as we know from all of the science, it is so hard to come forward. And they just refuse to, be ignored. And as was their right, he was in the Senate, which, we pay for that building in the Capitol. So I would have liked to see them slowly over the weekend. They started to I think they kind of did some interviews. So we started to learn a bit more about them. But I think they deserve credit, and I think that was, whereas, if you watch the sort of narrative that as it played out, right, we watched Dr. Ford, who was, it was incredibly moving and powerful, and, at one point everybody said, oh my God, what can Kavanaugh possibly say? And then he had sort of his performance. But then I think we sort of forgot the part that I think for a lot of viewers, the end point of the week was not just what Flake did, but these 2 women. And, for me, I'll never forget the sound of their voices confronting him.
Mary Catherine, quality of
Yeah.
coverage.
I think much of the press, and this is partly because of the 24-hour news cycle and this social media and partly because the press is in a bubble, I think is confused about whether it is part of a movement or it is reporting on this story. Believe all accusers, or believe women, or whatever the way that people phrase it, is a slogan for a movement, and it acknowledges a real thing that many women throughout history have not come forward with very good reason. It is not, however, a legal or intellectual standard that I am comfortable with in public. Like as a public figure on TV, I am called to be respectful to both the accuser and the accused, not to smear either one of them. And in all these sort of Me Too cases in this new era, I have thought through methodically, like, okay, well, what do I consider to be credible? Because I'm going to be called to do this, and I don't want to endanger people's character or reputation, and I want to be really careful about that. And so some of the things are a person who's on the record about the accusation, contemporaneous reports, not necessarily to law enforcement. It is helpful, as in the Roy Moore case, if those contemporaneous reports to friends have verifiable facts, like he was at the courthouse at this time, at the same time as the alleged victim. And then lastly, an MO of repeated behavior. In this particular case, we have one of those things. We have a named accuser. Now, some would argue there's a pattern of behavior. I think the different behaviors exhibited over various allegations, most of which are much less credible than Blasey Ford's, do not constitute the same type of MO or behavior. But that's debatable, fine. But the point being that, yes, it's not a court of law, but there is a cultural presumption of innocence in this country for a reason. And even though I am a woman who is more familiar with sexually threatening situations than I would like to be, I am not called to examine this based on that. I am called to examine this based on the facts that are at hand, and too often it feels like in media environments, the mere suggestion that we should is sliming accusers. And it is not. When we do not have anything else to go on except for these two people's compelling testimonies, I do have to go to the facts. And I do have to say there is no corroborating contemporaneous evidence. And in fact, someone being asked to prove they were not at a party of unknown location or time 35 years ago is not a standard that any one of us could meet. And I don't think is a fair standard for Democrat, Republican, man, woman, anyone. That is the conclusion I have come to. I am open to my mind being changed by FBI revelations. I'm not sure it will be, because I'm not sure there will be revelations. This is incredibly difficult to adjudicate. It is incredibly emotional for a lot of people with good reason. But to me, this is not a fair standard that I would ask any of you or any of my colleagues to meet, even if they were being put on the Supreme Court.
Sir.
I think we all, my name is Alan Flink. I'm a retired lawyer. I think we just heard the right's position on this issue. Some of us take a totally different position. This is not a court of law. We all know that. This is not a question of who's right or who's wrong. The question should be whether Brett Kavanaugh is an appropriate person to sit on the highest court in the United States. I submit, among other things, irrespective of who you believe or who you don't believe, that his manner of defending himself and his reference to certain political matters that he was intimately involved in many years ago when he was an adult, disqualify him because he does not come as a neutral, independent, impartial person. With respect to proof, it stands upon him to satisfy the American public as well as the Senate that he is worthy of the position that he aspires to. And I submit that he has failed in that test. Thank you.
Did he reveal himself to be too partisan to sit on the court? Is that a legitimate?
That you know, the opening statement that we all saw was quite remarkable. I understand he's in a difficult position. I understand that he feels wrongfully accused, or to at least some degree, we don't know exactly what he knows or doesn't know about the truth of the matter. But, you know, I do think it was incumbent upon him, because this is still part of the confirmation process, for him to, you know, demonstrate that he can be and remain impartial. And by, you know, decrying Democrats and the Clintons by name, being involved in, you know, more or less a conspiracy against him, even if he believes that to be true. And I, you know, don't think this was the revenge of the Clintons here. If it was, I think Di-Fi would have rushed to get this out. I think he's just factually wrong on that. But that was a shocking moment. And I think it should give pause about whether he can rise above this. And if he's been wrongfully accused, rising above it is a hard thing. I understand that. And no one should have to rise above a false accusation if it is indeed false. But if anyone should be expected to do that, it is someone who sits on the Supreme Court, before whom will be cases involving the very people, the left-wing opposition groups, maybe even the Clintons and the Democrats that will come before him. So I thought that was, at least strategically, a mistake, and perhaps more importantly, an insight into the fact that a person who had already been accused, rightfully or wrongfully, of being a very partisan player in the past, indicating that on the question of temperament, it might, you know, he might not be best suited for this job.
This is a massive category error. And in this case, his role is not to be a neutral arbiter of his own, of some case brought by third parties. It is to defend himself and to defend his honor. And the fact is, if he hadn't come out that strongly, he'd be dead right now, which the other side would be completely happy with. And so this is also a massive instance of concern trolling. We're going to throw everything we have at you, and whatever you do not show any passion in your defense. That would be terrible. No one should do that if they're accused of crimes up to and including being party to a gang rape ring that you ran in suburban Montgomery County as a teenager. That is a charge that was made, that was taken seriously by the media, that was plastered over a couple cable networks. NBC News, to his credit, actually had an interview with his accuser yesterday, and she immolated her own credibility. It was almost like an SNL parody of an unreliable accuser. So this is not a judicial case. If you want to look at how he handles judicial cases, you have 200 or 300 opinions that he wrote as part of the D.C. circuit. And then just two other points briefly. He didn't allege a conspiracy run by the Clintons. He said that part of the motivation and the anger that is directed at him has to do with the sore and raw feelings from Democrats over losing the election. And please do not tell me that Democrats do not still have sore and raw feelings over losing the election.
He
They
used
do.
the word,
Rich, one last
he said
point.
revenge of the Clintons is
One
what he
last-
called this.
one
He
last
cited
point.
the Clintons. I'm not making that
On
up.
behalf of the Clintons, because they lost. Because
Revenge
Hillary
of-
Clinton ran in 2016 and lost, and Democrats are upset about it. This is a fact. You can also Google that. And then finally, it's just very easy to be relaxed about the assassination of someone else's reputation. But all of us as human beings, when we're charged with something unfairly, and I submit to you, whatever else you think, whether he's thrown ice at Yale or whatever else, he's not guilty of gang rape, and just that alone should have had him up there and furiously defending his good name.
Karen.
I don't recall him being accused of gang rape. I think what the woman said was that that there was a situation of a gang rape situation, that he was present at a gathering.
He was prepping the women. Read the sworn affidavit.
Okay.
He was prepping the women with punch. Then they're being taken to rooms where people are lining up, boys are lining up to go and gang rape these women. And it was all Mark Judge and Brett Kavanaugh running this operation. That's what it says in black and white.
Okay, more importantly, though, I think what's interesting here is back in 2006, the ABA raised similar concerns, and I have the language right here in front of me. He says he can be immovable and very stubborn and frustrating to deal with. They questioned his freedom from bias and his open-mindedness, and they also gave him an opportunity to respond to some of that. So I think to David's point, what I agree with here is that, going in, you're seeking to be the, a member of the Supreme Court, right? You should, understanding you're upset and you're angry and all of that. But again, you do, and knowing that this is already a perception about you, I would have expected there is a way to convey your anger without, asking senators if, they've gotten blackout drunk or do they like beer? I mean, the whole, so I think there was again, if you're asking to be seen as someone who could sit on the Supreme Court, I think there was a different way to handle it. And I think to David's point, I think what a lot of us saw, I mean, for me personally, I think there were already plenty of reasons that I disagreed with his nomination to the Supreme Court. I certainly thought, even if you take the allegations by Dr. Ford out of it, his behavior, to my mind, was not consistent with what I would want from a jurist. Sonia Sotomayor was, had some slurs at her during her hearing, and she, kept her cool. So I think it's very relevant that back in 2006, the ABA actually downgraded him, their rating of him, in part because of his temperament and because of concerns about his bias. I think that is relevant information to this conversation.
I think I just want to put a bow on this. Excuse me, sorry. I don't want to subject everyone to two versions of my voice. Are we good? Okay. I'm just going to say, I think as far as media goes in the Me Too moment, I do think folks need to make a decision about how they're going to cover accusations and what kind of due diligence they're going to do. And there's two examples, very stark, both from Ronan Farrow. The Harvey Weinstein stuff was reported within an inch of its life. There was an MO, there were people on the record, there were contemporaneous reports, there were details that were verifiable. The other Ronan Farrow story about the second Kavanaugh allegation, I think was, and I like him and he's done good work before, it was shoddy. It was shoddy. The people who were at the thing said they weren't there. She said she's not sure it's him. And it's also a sort of a microcosm of the media credibility problem. He had gained tremendous credibility with the Weinstein reporting and with some of his Me Too stuff because it was so detailed and very responsible. This was not, and I think he lost a lot of credibility, certainly with me. It makes me wonder what shortcuts he was taking with other things. And in journalism school, which, by the way, journalism is not a thing you have to go to school for because it's just repeating the truth when people tell you things. But I did go to school for it. And in school, the number one instructor warning about a thing you do not run with because the mere accusation could ruin someone's life, unless you are very, very sure, was sexual crimes. And so we have to decide moving forward how you reconcile that with believe all victims or with believe all women. We do have a cultural presumption of innocence even outside of a court of law, and that is good. It's good for all of us. And preserving that in the Me Too moment is going to be interesting, and media needs to decide how they want to do it.
There's a great version of that phrase, which is listen to women, which doesn't necessarily believe, but take seriously what they say, give it due consideration, which is something that certainly has not happened in years past. And I think that's, a good way to frame this issue as we move ahead.
I think we can all agree on that formulation of it.
I want to thank our panelists for representing four distinct perspectives. We don't often get
Or at least two.
We don't often get, no, everybody has
Two and a half, maybe.
Slightly different take on things, and I appreciate that. I really appreciate your time on this. You've left us with a lot to still think about and a lot to still discuss. So thank you very much.
Thank you.